I am a big fan of everybody's got kind of their gravitational pull ideologically in American history. I like the Republican Party of 1854. I think it's one of the grooviest things ever put together. And by the way, the Republican Party of 1854 and the Democratic Party of 1854 and the Whig Party of 1854, they ain't the same things. I'm a big fan of the Free Soilers, which were one of part of the great coalition that created the Republican Party of 1854. The basic concept of Free Soilers is free soil, free men. And the idea they were opposed to slavery because it was a vast group of technicians. I mean, that's what it was. It was people that could repair wagons, people that could make engines, people could do all kinds of groovy stuff. And they wanted the right to pick up their trowel and cross the state line and practice their craft wherever they wanted to practice it and not have to compete with slave labor. Of course, the great example of that is a lanky fella who liked to split rails, who moved from Kentucky into Illinois and then used the money that he made as a free soiler to become an attorney for the Union Pacific Railroad. That man's name, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. We're going back a little bit earlier, but I have on my staff here a guy who's pretty darn good at cutting hair and a lady who's pretty darn good at making movies. And what they can tell you is that it's expensive to do what they do, that all barbers have to own their own equipment, and that so many filmmakers, if you don't have access to equipment early, you don't get the reps in that you need. If you don't come from money, or at least people who are committed to making sure your dreams come true, it becomes very hard to break in to either one of those industries. By the way, I'm telling you right now, cutting hair is a tough racket because there's a lot of people out there who claim they can do it. And there's a lot of nice barbershops in a lot of downtown areas of people who are competing, and they're able to do it either because they found a patron who was willing to finance them, or they found themselves a rich family, which, by the way, you don't find. You're often born into, or you join their company and they lay you out with the cash that you need. I say all that, by the way, because we just talked about 1854. We're going to jump back a whole lot earlier here. This is the first edition on our new platform on Rhode Gang Radio, and it sets up a wonderful 4th of July we're going to have. We met this guy at the 4th of July, by the way, Trey. This is where we first met David Otersen. He is a contributing author at the Journal of the American Revolution, which, by the way, is the relationship we have that gives us Revolution Road with the Journal of the American Revolution. Its first appearance on hashtag RGR, and we're thrilled to have David, of all people. He's a history enthusiast with a particular interest in the American Revolution and a history of constitutional law, which looms very large these days. He earned Dean's List distinctions at the University of Maryland College Park, which, by the way, has the best logo in all of college sports, where he studied government, economics, and philosophy. By profession, he's a retired corporate sales executive and currently resides in Northern Virginia with his wife and family. We are thrilled to welcome him as the first contributor to Revolution Road with the Journal of the American Revolution. Go to allthingsliberty.com. David Otersen joins us this morning. How are you, sir, and welcome back.
I'm very well, and I'm delighted to be back. And I think you had mentioned, or I had spoken with your producer, Andre, and I visited with you last July 4th. That was a delightful experience. I expect this to be as well. So, again, thank you for the warm welcome.
Oh, yeah, and we are thrilled to have you guys back. I can't tell you, when we changed platforms, when we moved over to iHeart, when we moved over to 365, Audacity, all of these new platforms we're on, we got a lot of requests saying, you are bringing Revolution Road, are you not? And I said, we wouldn't miss it for the world. And it's so good, by the way, given the topic we're talking about and given your previous contributions, to have a friend join us for the first edition. So thank you for honoring us with your presence. Let's just kind of...
Again, delighted to be here.
Let's just dig into it. Constitutional anomalies in the founding era. And tell me if I get this right. What you're talking about here is that any system of government, any system of complex government, because dictatorships aren't complex. I say you do. But any sort of working with other people to create a more perfect union means there's going to be imperfections or anomalies or strangeness inside of the document that will take more than a couple of years to resolve and figure out how to kind of either fix, adjust, or make perfect. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair, and perhaps we go a little bit beyond that, or maybe emphasize that and some other ideas as well. And maybe if I could segue into the specific examples by reminding everyone. Now, I know you have a July 4 episode coming up, so I don't want to crowd that space. But maybe, again, point out, for example, when we look at history, it's often not as linear and as orderly as we are maybe originally led to believe. It's not as streamlined as we are originally led to believe. So speaking to that issue very briefly, it might be helpful to remind the audience that, as an example, we celebrate, of course, July 4th as American Independence Day. And it's often forgotten that actually July 2nd is American Independence Day because that's the day on which the Continental Congress actually adopted the Virginia Resolution on Independence, which was the legal instrument separating the colonies from the British Empire. Over time, it has evolved that much more emphasis is placed now, of course, on the Declaration rather than the resolution. And that largely, I think, is unsurprising because the Declaration is filled with such inspirational language having to do with the rights of humanity. So it has eclipsed the simple resolution. Some of the language is the same. Jefferson borrowed some of that language from the resolution where he makes the claim, or the statement, I should say, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. That's language that was also used in the resolution adopted on July 2nd. So again, I use that as an example. And oh, by the way, on top of that, on July 2nd, when John Adams later wrote his wife Abigail, he described that forevermore Americans would celebrate July 2nd with celebrations and festivities and parades and illuminations and all the things that we now do on the 4th. Adams anticipated, of course, Adams was one of the great founding fathers, but Adams anticipated all of that would have been done on the 2nd simply because that was the day, again, that the Continental Congress legally separated. But as I repeat, the emphasis now placed on the 4th. So that's the sort of thing that I'm looking at, things that are maybe overlooked and misunderstood or an emphasis placed elsewhere, and to remind the audience that things are, again, a little more complicated than they sometimes might appear. And I hope that makes sense to everyone.
It makes perfect sense to me. I have a follow-up question, and I don't know the answer to it, so I'm not being an attorney who's got expectations of hearing a certain thing from you. I was curious about the 2nd, 4th issue. I've kind of thought about this in the past, and it kind of talks about that even the Founding Fathers did not know what they were creating to some degree. And I'm not sure the particulars here. Did people become more aware publicly of what was going on in its kind of fruition, its full kind of realization on the 4th, meaning that those in the know and those in the circle right outside of those in the know knew what was kind of going down on the 2nd, but that it's not until the 4th where it's like, they called the Battle of New Orleans in 1814 the thunderclap, that was heard around the nation. But is the 4th of July where people really around the country start going, wait a minute, this really is real? Is that kind of what happens there?
And I think that's an excellent point, and it will help me, as I said, segue into the next line of reasoning. But and part of it had to do with, if you remember, as a general idea, Washington wanted the Declaration read, and it was read, and it was publicly celebrated both on the 4th and then immediately thereafter. So ultimately, again, because of the rousing and inspirational ideas and ideals that were promulgated by the Declaration, it eclipsed the very simple legal dry statement of we're now an independent nation, because the Declaration was surrounded, I repeat, with all this magnificent language, this inspirational, these Enlightenment ideals. So yes, when those ideals became communicated publicly, it of course then eclipsed, as I mentioned, the very dry, subtle language of the resolution. So I hope that answers the question, but I very much agree with the principle you just put forth.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And that brings me to my final point, and then we will segue into all this groovy stuff you've actually lined up for us today. And I'm wondering, too, if many ways this actually tips us off to what even the people who were doing the thing didn't realize what they were doing, because Adams is talking about this celebration on the 2nd, not realizing that his voice is only going out to those who are, I guess, firmly fixed on what is already unfolding. The equivalent would be people who were very much online knew what was happening. By July 4th, everybody else knew what was happening. And Adams didn't even conceive of the idea that to become something national, the people had to know, correct?
That's correct. And Adams, the other comment I think I'd make is that Adams, as a practical matter, and again, we tend to look at the founders as almost sometimes mythical figures and infallible, and of course that's very far from the truth. They were certainly capable statesmen, but they were human beings like you and I, and they had flaws and imperfections and ideas and prejudices and so forth and biases, and that has to be contemplated. There's I think an interesting aspect that Adams, it is said, was to some degree really almost jealous of Jefferson because Jefferson himself referred to Adams as the Colossus of independence, but his efforts, as magnificent as they were also eclipsed by Jefferson's splendid work in the Declaration. So I think that's spot on again. I think your point is spot on one more time.
Yeah, and like I said, the people who write history are the ones who end up, as the Confederacy learned, not too soon after, that if you get a chance to get there first and write what happened, people tend to believe you. It takes the truth a long time to catch up as well, although truth is both present on the second and the fourth. I'm sorry, that I know that you didn't intend to take us that far into the weeds because I dragged you along into the weeds, out into left field
That's okay.
for the 4th of July. But let's kind of get to this stuff too. Constitutional anomalies in the founding era. Let's kind of unpack that.
Okay, so there are a number, some more pronounced than others, but I think the first thing I'd start with, and here again very, very briefly, is that when the war was fought, between 1776 and the fighting generally stopped with the sermon at Yorktown, and then 2 years later, of course, was the peace treaty. But between 1776 and let's say the Declaration, and we could refer to the second, but traditionally, of course, it's the fourth. So we'll refer to the fourth. Between the 4th of July, 1776, and March 1st of 1781, the Continental Congress and then the country was operating with no constitution at all. The Articles of Confederation had been drafted in 1776, but they required unanimous ratification, and Maryland withheld its consent for a number of years. They had particular quarrels, and so they withheld it. So for those 5 years during which the war was fought, there was no written constitution, which meant this. If we look, for example, at Article 1, Section 8 of our present Constitution, it enumerates the powers of Congress. What the Continental Congress and the American colonies were rebelling against was this idea of parliamentary sovereignty. I know that many of the charges, of course, in the Declaration were directed specifically against King George III, but what had led up to the Declaration, of course, were all the legislation, the Sugar Act, the Tea Act, and so forth, and the Stamp Act, of course, that began it all. But under the British Constitution, Parliament was sovereign. There was no authority higher than Parliament. They had it was an unwritten constitution largely, and they had ultimate sovereignty. Well, during the course of the Revolution, the Continental Congress did not have any written instrument by which to measure and judge their authority. They arrogated and assumed specific authority, and so for that 5-year period, they were practicing precisely what they were rebelling against. There were no limitations on the authority. For example, when they appointed George Washington as the head of the Continental Army in June of 1775, they had no authority to do it. Under the Constitution, of course, all those, and even under the Articles of Confederation, when it was finally ratified, specified what those powers would be and how they were to be exercised. That wasn't the case. When we arranged a loan from the Dutch, or when we entered into diplomatic relations with the Spanish, the Articles of Confederation had not yet been ratified. Congress, Continental Congress that is, was arrogating to themselves all those authority for which they didn't have it. The other irony, I think, that's interesting is that the Continental Congress, when they did finally declare independence, did precisely the opposite of what they were originally intended to do, which was to restore and rehabilitate relations with the mother country, with Great Britain, rather than destroy and sever them. So there were two ironies, one of which was they were practicing for a period of a full 5 years exactly what they were rebelling against by assuming unwritten, unlimited authority and sovereignty. And then at the same time, as I mentioned, they did this for a period of 5 years. So I think those two ironies, to my mind, are pronounced and generally probably not paid a whole lot of attention to.
It's interesting too because we're very lucky as a nation too, because a lot of the things that they did, they just kind of thought up and did, and then kind of considered the consequences later. It would have been very easy to stay in that place, which would have then led to more chaos down the line. But these guys absolutely understood absolute power, and therefore said, you know what, man, I might like wielding this, but the thought of somebody else wielding this is terrifying to me. So maybe we should put limits on everybody else. I'm fine. It's you I'm worried about, so I'll limit myself. Is kind of the thinking here.
And I think that's because that's exactly what happened. There's a further irony, if I can get to it here again very briefly, is that this matter came before the Supreme Court in 1795, and I think this is even a more tremendous irony. And this discussion took place, and it was William Patterson, who was a Supreme Court judge at the time, trying to determine what authority the Continental Congress had or had before the Confederation Congress came into being. But it was interesting because he said, these are exactly the kind of authorities that we have to be careful about. But they ultimately decided, the Supreme Court, it was a case of, not a very well-known case, it's called Penhall versus Dones administrators, but they ultimately decided that Congress did have the powers that they were exercising simply because the general population acquiesced in the exercise of those powers, but they were nowhere written. Here's the irony, I think. The Constitution gives the Supreme Court only the authority to decide cases, and I'll use the language under, quote, this Constitution. They really had no authority to make a decision based on the Articles of Confederation. They didn't exist under the Articles of Confederation. So those three elements, those three that I just identified, I think are very pronounced anomalies that, again, don't generally receive a whole lot of attention.
Basically, we're just thrilled to have David Otersen with us this morning. You're saying that the reason we created the Constitution because so much of what we were doing before then was unconstitutional.
I'm sorry to say so, but in a sense that seems to be the case. That seems to be the case.
You got some particular examples here, by the way, and by the way, I do love the fact that at the end of the day, though, the deference to the Supreme Court saying that the people's acquiescence or the people's approval has to be the starting point. There is something kind of uniquely special and almost beautiful about that. The idea that people seem to be okay with this, so we're going to be okay with this, even though we don't have the authority. The people do, and the original documents of the Second and the Fourth actually say that the power comes from the people, and therefore all of that becomes the origin point for where we head next. Is that fair?
That is fair, and forgive me because now you're spot on all of this stuff, and I'm going to have to now maybe disappoint you a little with two other ones, but one's kind of fun that I want to introduce if that's okay, and then move on to something more substantively that you just described in terms of this the idea behind what maybe we can call popular sovereignty. But there's a fun little item. There are two fun items in my judgment that often get overlooked, and see if this makes sense to you. I've argued, and some of these things that, by the way, that we're discussing, I've written about over at the JAR, but there's one I thought was kind of a fun item. It's not significant, it's not devastating, it doesn't hurt anyone, but nevertheless, both when George Washington and John Adams assumed their respective offices as president and vice president in April of 1789, about 9 days separated the two. Adams was actually entered into office on the 21st, about 9 days in advance of Washington being inaugurated as the president. But here's the interesting thing. If we look at Article 2, and specifically Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, it specifies the requirements to become president, what the eligibility. And they're very minimalist. They're very simple. But one of them is that the candidate has to be at least 35 years of age, as you probably will know. But here's the key language, and 14 years a resident within the United States. That's the language. Well, if we date American independence, and here's your material, we can date it from July 2nd or July 4th, 1776. Before those days, let's use July 2nd as a date, before July 2nd, there was no United States. There was simply an aggregation of British colonies. They weren't even united under the Constitution. We did that in defiance of the constitutional norms, but there was no union. So there was certainly no United States. Those were all simply British colonies. Now, here's the interesting thing to my mind. If we date 14 years from 1776, from July of 1776, we obviously get to July 2nd, 1790. But both Washington and Adams entered office over a full year in advance of satisfying the 14-year residency requirement. With Adams, there's even a further complication.
Yeah.
The language, is very specific. It says within the United States, and as you probably know, for a good 8 or 10 years, about 10 years, Adams was serving as a diplomat in Europe, in the Netherlands and in Spain and in France. So he would have had even more difficulty satisfying the residency requirement, but neither of them did because they didn't match or meet or satisfy the 14-year requirement because the United States itself didn't exist for 14 years. So I thought that was a very curious anomaly that hasn't been paid, in my mind, a whole lot of attention.
Well, yeah, I think it's really groovy too, because I mean, then you get down to the matter of not just his work overseas, like drumming up support for the revolution while the war is going on, but then there's the issue of the time he spends as the ambassador to the Court of St. James too. Although you can make a case saying that he is a resident of the United States because he in fact resides in the ambassador's, residence, which of course puts him on American soil. Man, it's so much fun because you're setting up rules that don't apply to yourself that are going to then kick in for everybody else once you leave. I mean, that's the crazy thing about it. I mean, that is what's so interesting that's playing itself out here. How can you create rules and like I said, it's how can you create a rule that doesn't apply to you, but you can't figure out any way to make it apply to you, so you've just got to kind of make it up as you go along. It's kind of fascinating.
Well, the other fascinating thing that you said, by the way, and you have a fine legal mind, because when you described Adams, in his efforts as a diplomat in Europe, and the argument can be made that he was, even though he was abroad, he was domiciled here, and that's exactly the interpretation that Justice Story put on it in his magnificent work, Commentaries on the Constitution. That's the exact argument he made. And I accept that argument. However, that doesn't negate the other argument, meaning that the United States itself had not existed for 14 years, so neither could satisfy the 14-year residency requirement, irrespective of whether you counted Adams at the time in Europe as living here. He still wouldn't have satisfied the 14-year residency requirement because the country itself hadn't existed for 14 years.
Which means, essentially, if you interpret the law absolutely in an Antonin Scalia sort of way, right down to the last period, essentially nobody could be president until the 14 years had actually transpired. Meaning, like, we don't have a president until that 14th year is hit, and then somebody can actually assume the office. And by the way, I think it's amazing, however, that people need to understand. People say, what has gone wrong in this country that we challenge people's eligibility for the president every 5 minutes? Man, people were challenging people's eligibility for the presidency from the moment this thing began, right?
It's the nature of politics. And you lead me to another interesting point, because in the same provision, in other words, the qualifications for president, if you remember, one of the qualifications, which is subject today to some degree of controversy, but if you remember the language natural-born citizen, well, and I'll refer to Justice Story again here, because in that specific provision, they actually made, if you remember, an exception, because the language was natural-born citizen or a citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. What's interesting about that is that Story, for example, again referring to Justice Story, referred to that provision, and he said, okay, well, the reason that exception language is in there is because that may have caused offense, for example, to some of the foreign nationals, for example, Lafayette or von Steuben, who had made such tremendous contributions to the war effort, so we would not want to exclude them had they decided to toss their hat in the ring for presidency. But what Story doesn't mention is that if that exception had not been made, nobody would have been eligible because everyone was born as a British subject. Nobody was a natural-born citizen. So he somehow overlooked that as well. So I think you're raising some very good points here, if you don't mind my saying so.
Well, thank you very much. What I think is really interesting, too, could you imagine that, is we can't have a president until we have somebody who was born on July 2nd of 1770. I mean, we could go on for a while with this. I mean, that could... But, by the way, you've just given me an intriguing thought. Can you imagine a Lafayette von Steuben ticket? That'd be kind of groovy, wouldn't it?
Sorry. Yeah, that would be an interesting thing, and I'm not sure how that would have been received, but I almost shiver or shudder at the possibility.
Oh, my God. Can you imagine von Steuben in charge of the national bureaucracy? Oh, my God.
It would have been very tightly run, I would expect.
Yeah, by the way, it would have made Alexander Hamilton say, "Hey, man, you're being a little bit too tight here. You need to let off the throttle."
I would think so. I would think so.
Anybody that would make Alexander Hamilton say exercise a little less control of the situation is probably somebody we shouldn't trust with
Not
exercise.
someone you want up there.
Not somebody you want up there. I want to make sure we shift it because there's some more substantive stuff you want to talk about. We've only got about 2 or 3 minutes left. Can you believe how fast this section is gone? We're almost done.
I cannot, because if you don't mind me saying so, I've made a couple notes, things I was hoping to get to, and the conversation has been wonderful, but we will not, of course, get to everything that we might have, but it's been a wonderful discussion nevertheless.
I tell you what, we're going to get you to come back at some point and maybe just shoot the Shinola with me at some other date. But is there anything you want to preview for the next time we talk? Because we really are out of time. I can't believe how fast this went.
No, the last thing I would make is in the advertisement you had mentioned, or the station had mentioned, the first meeting of Congress itself was unconstitutional, and that can be discussed very briefly. It's not altogether consequential. However, the Constitution does specify that the first meeting of Congress was to take place on the first Monday in December, and that was ignored completely and entirely for a number of reasons, which maybe we can get into a later date. And the first meeting of Congress actually took place in March of 1789. So it's explicitly specified in the Constitution that the first meeting of Congress must take place again on the first Monday of December. They somehow felt at liberty to disregard that, met in March instead. There are reasons behind that, but here again, a very obvious bright line constitutional breach, not terribly significant, but nevertheless the breach it was, and that I thought too deserved mention as an early anomaly.
So the whole foundation of this entire country, from the way the presidency was ascended to the way the Constitution meeting of Congress was violated, it's all based on a lie. It's all just made up.
It's almost a Keystone Cop effect. If you think about it, here we are launching this magnificent republic, which we all agree we did, and we start out with a vice president and a president who were ineligible for office, and a Congress whose first meeting was unconstitutional.
There's a great line from the Avengers, by the way, where somebody says, "You just made that word up," and the response is, "All words are made up. At the end of the day, all governments are made up, and they all spring from popular acclamation." And I got to tell you, my popular acclamation says, "It is such a pleasure to have you as the first guest on Revolution Road with the Journal of the American Revolution. David Otersen, you are welcome back anytime. If we don't get a chance to talk before episode 249 of The United States Begins, happiest of 4th to you as well."
Happy 4th to you, and I enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you, David.